Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Piot, and I'm chairing this panel on new policies and contexts that negatively impact on funding for the response to HIV. And I think this is a very important discussion because the environment is, of course, as always, changing. But I think today we are really in, I think, yet another crucial time for the AIDS response. And we will look at not only at funding, but also in general, but always how it's related to specific areas relevant to the AIDS response. And I hope we will look specifically at why and how the priority for AIDS may not be able to remain in the face of these new restrictive contexts and policies. But I'm always a pragmatist in the sense that as my old professor of social medicine in my medical school said, a problem without a solution is not a problem. You need to do research. So we need to make sure that we are not only identifying the problems, but also try to be imaginative and how we think we can overcome them. This is just not for... so we need to see how we can overcome these barriers to ensure that AIDS remains on the agenda and is matched with funding. But it's not just about funding for funding's sake. It's the quantity and the quality of funding that are both important. It's about people and their rights to health, to benefit from scientific advancements, and here I think AIDS has shown the way to many other issues, and so forth. Now, as you all know, there's growing concern that the world's commitment to HIV is waning. We are becoming complacent in our efforts, and when you look at the last UNAIDS report, miles to go, it shows that we don't have enough funding to sustain the necessary response. In other words, to sustain access to retroviral therapy with increasing numbers of people living with HIV and who will require that funding and treatment for decades to come. So we need to have a bit of more long-term thinking here, which is, of course, very difficult in any political context. And we have also the huge needs in terms of prevention. And it's not only, as I said, the quantity and the quality, but also the distribution of funding. Is it there where the needs are? Let's hear about that. And for example, also prevention in general is systematically underrepresented in budget lines. There is a page in the UNAIDS report that's pretty shocking, some circles that show the segment that's dedicated to prevention. And we as a global health field, we must and we can take a leading role in resisting the turn in many national contexts towards more inward-looking authoritarianism, xenophobia, austerity, with respect to essential public investments. So we really need to make sure that we can rejuvenate investment to support our efforts towards sustainable and people-centered health solutions. So our speakers today will discuss some of the key political context and policies, also from the Trump administration, I hope, and the global gag rule. Remind you that under the Bush administration, there was also global gag rule, but it was, AIDS funding, by far so, was exempt. That's no longer the case. And we have all the rhetoric about how we have to work together and integrate better and so on. But when the funding stream makes that impossible, it forces people to make choices that they should not have to make. So we'll see how we can overcome that. And I would like to add on this also the shrinking space for civil society. There also we need rejuvenated efforts here in Europe and many other places of the world, refugees, migrants, displaced populations, and so on. So I hope we will learn more about the interrelated challenges that threaten critical funding for the HIV response, but also what can be done to ensure we have sustainable financing and prioritization for AIDS moving forward. We really have a stellar panel, and I won't read the bios of everybody, but let me briefly introduce our first speaker, Patrick Gaspard, who's the president of the Open Society Foundation, and a foundation that has played a huge role for many years now in promoting good governance, human rights, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, where you're famous for, but also in many other parts of the world. So, Patrick, thanks so much for being with us, and please, you have the floor.
Should I?
Whatever you want to do, yeah.
You know what, I'll go there.
Yeah, sure.
It's easier. Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to join you here today on behalf of the Open Society Foundations, and it's odd that as I join you in a conversation about the rise of liberalism, populism, and its direct impact on HIV and AIDS services, in a queer way, I suddenly find myself thrust into the realm of a new kind of 1%. I'm going to explain that comment in a moment, but don't lose the thread of it, please. So I've been asked to comment on the current political landscape, its impact on the funding for the AIDS crisis. That landscape is, of course, regrettably, tragically blanketed by an unprecedented wave of anti-women, anti-choice, racist, and homophobic policies enacted recently by nationalist and populist governments. But you all know that already. It's a landscape where human rights and funding for rights is under attack. My organization has experienced those attacks most directly. Our work in this field is under scrutiny from Kinshasa to Nairobi, from Budapest to Phnom Penh, and to Caracas and Skopje as well. The Open Society Foundations has been banned, maybe I should say has been proudly banned, in China, Russia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Egypt, and perhaps the United States is next. And most recently, in Hungary, the birthplace of our founding chairman, George Soros, I recently had to work to move 170 of our staff from that country because of the passage of regressive laws out to Berlin. The challenges that we're facing in our network, the challenges that NGOs writ large, civil society writ large are facing in this moment, mirror the places where healthcare rights for the most marginalized have become increasingly restricted. Once upon a time, there was a radical kinetic energy around the notion that we could continue an astounding march towards the eradication of illnesses and measurably improved health outcomes in each part of the globe. The aspiration hung on globalization as a virtuous phenomena. We lived in a world rationalized, although imperfectly, by recognition of intertwined national interests in freedom of movement, access to information, and an instinct that long-term economic and security improvements in wealthy countries derived from subsidies and investments in poorer ones, once upon a time. The financial crash of 2008, the euro crisis of 2010, coupled with record levels of humanitarian crisis and refugee movements, disrupted the fairy tale and gave birth to an age of anger, and an age of majority grievance and hyper-sovereignty, where too many believe that it's possible to wall off the world, build moats, and pull up the drawbridge with absolutely no consequence. This is a toxic isolation grounded in a mythologized and profoundly insecure identity politics. Long before the crisis of climate change or the interdependencies of mobile currencies, Jean Monnet, the French economist who was one of the principal forces behind the formation of the European Union, noted that sovereign nations of the past can no longer solve the problems of the present. They cannot ensure their own progress or control their own futures. He could have been talking about Ebola or raging TB, which do not recognize sovereign borders. In this environment that we're currently existing in a diminished capacity for solidarity, not only have commitments stalled, but regressive protocols have been promulgated with acute effects. This should mean that our work here, our conversation here, is more important than ever. But some of us have the bad habit of judging priorities based on budget lines. Which brings me back to the unique club of the 1%, that many and most of us are in. There's been considerable talk here in Amsterdam about the critical interventions of rights activists in HIV, AIDS, TB outcomes. That was also the case in the last AIDS conference that I participated in a few short years ago in Durban, when I served as the U.S. ambassador to South Africa. I can't imagine occupying that post today. Despite all of the talk here, despite all the talk then in Durban, we have to recognize that rights-based work in HIV and AIDS intervention is the least funded part of the work, comprising less than 1% of all private and bilateral funding for HIV. This includes the Global Fund and the UN. We all know the difference that rights-based work has made and can imagine what it would accomplish in a moment when our opponents are better organized and more vicious than ever. And let's be really clear here. We do have opponents. Let's go to the U.S. The U.S. has, of course, infamously reinstated the Mexico City policy or the global gag rule, a shameful, reprehensible policy that prohibits U.S.-funded organizations across the globe from providing abortion services, counseling, or referrals, and gags them from advocating to decriminalize abortion or to expand abortion services. Trump's version of the policy not only restricts the ability of people to make decisions about their own reproductive health, but also threatens to undo decades of progress made on broader health services, including HIV treatment and prevention and service integration. While the full impact of this policy is yet to be documented, it's clear that lives are imperiled every single day. The stories from the field are just absolutely disheartening and disconcerting. According to new research from the Center for Health and Gender Equity, in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean NGO Population Services, a Marie Stopes initiative that specializes in sexual and reproductive health services, declined USAID funding so that they wouldn't have to comply with this awful policy. The organization provided family planning services to 650,000 Zimbabweans in all 10 provinces, including extremely hard-to-reach rural locations. The loss of the U.S. funds amounts to 56% of their budget and has resulted in a 50% scale back of outreach services. Now, if you have been in Zimbabwe of late, you know that in the transition that they're experiencing in government, in the run-up to the elections, there's just a dearth of resources available to organize coherent civil society, to advocate for free, fair elections with integrity, and to push back on the ground against these challenges to funding as well. We also have another challenge I just want to note for those of you who are engaged in the U.S., politically active in the U.S. If you go to Capitol Hill and you have a conversation with Democrats and Republicans who have worked on PEPFAR, who have been in the field with those of us who have been struggling around rights for marginalized communities suffering from HIV and AIDS for several decades, you will recognize very quickly that most of our champions on both sides of the aisle are just on the older spectrum of U.S. senators and U.S. members of Congress. We have not grown through our concerted advocacy a new generation of champions in Congress or in the U.S. Senate. So it's fantastic that we'll be joined by members of Congress during this session who are on the front lines way at the beginning of PEPFAR. But if we're not getting perhaps some of the candidates who will be running in 2020 to lean in on this issue, we're losing an opportunity and we are losing momentum. The current U.S. administration is not only pursuing policies that are hurting people, but also, and this is what's really important about this environment that we're living in right now, it's failing to condemn other governments who are doing the same. If there were any doubt about the declining stature of the U.S. in the world, witness the current occupant of the White House's engagement and encouragement of the deadly policies of President Duterte in the Philippines. The launch of the brutal war on drugs in the Philippines has plunged the country into its worst human rights crisis in decades. The crisis has included more than 12,000 extrajudicial killings of people, including children, and a consistent call for violence against people who use drugs, who are infected by the president of that republic. The impact on the HIV epidemic is absolutely striking. The drug war has meant the closure of harm reduction programs on which people depend, such as a program providing sterile injecting equipment to people at risk in coastal cities. This is happening in a country where the HIV infection rates have doubled in the last 6 years, making it the fastest growing epidemic in the Asian Pacific region. And it is a direct consequence of human rights violations and human rights violations that are endorsed by the President of the United States. More generally, we have a chilling of any open discussion of drugs and health and a stigmatization and fear, which of course can only lead to increased challenges. I find it difficult these days to have any conversation about the political environment, the rise of liberalism, the extreme populism that's taking hold not just in the U.S. but throughout the world, and most especially in Eastern Europe, without bringing Russia into the room. These days, it's a lot of fun to bring Russia into the room. We all know, of course, that that is a place where the link between illiberal democracy and HIV infection is not a new phenomenon. In Russia, in addition to the ongoing incursion into the Ukraine, the federal government continues to ban methadone and other medications that are demonstrated to reduce heroin injection and HIV risk, and has refused to support needle and syringe programs. Worse than has refused to support, actually had flourishing programs that were rolled back and vilified at about the same time that we were banned from the country. It's instead forcing those international donors as well to close doors. As harm reduction has diminished, HIV has continued to rise in the country, and Russia now has the largest number of HIV-infected citizens of any country in Europe. And you can rest assured, again, direct correlation between violation of rights in general. Eastern Europe remains a region where HIV is growing and where ending AIDS cannot happen until we end opposition to programming that reaches the people who use drugs who are at greatest risk. A few days ago here in this conference, I had a conversation with Peter Saruzzi, who is from Hungary and runs the Rights Reporter Foundation. And Peter just reminded me something really important that's happened in Hungary over the last several years that speaks to the way those of us in this community who are passionate about this issue need to make certain that we take seriously the need for intersectionality in our movements. Peter reminded me that a few years ago, in 2013, the Hungarian parliament passed legislation that criminalized homelessness, and there wasn't enough rallying and outcry from other communities because they weren't homeless, and so this didn't apply to them. The following year, in 2014, the government banned the needle exchanges in the country, and those in the majority party of Fidesz, parliamentarians, actually came out and organized massive mobilizations against the needle exchange initiatives. Those in other parts of the NGO community, the healthcare community, did not step forward on that issue. And remain silent. And of course, last year and this year, that parliament has now promulgated a series of laws that basically make it impossible to do any work in the country on issues of migration, managed to attack academic freedom, and is in the midst of shutting down the Central European University, and of course has kicked a number of significant nonprofits and NGOs out of Hungary. And I dare say that if there had been some earlier acts of solidarity with the gay homeless community, with those who were recipients of the benefits of the needle exchange, that perhaps there would have been a greater outpouring in Hungary around these other issues that could have pushed back Fidesz. I'm going to conclude by raising a challenge for us and the Global Fund and other donors, and by raising one other country. And I also hope to be able to lift up a little bit of a sense of aspiration for what is possible, a little bit of hopefulness. I want to mention, the country I want to mention is Venezuela. It's hard to talk about this moment, this authoritarian rise and its impact on health outcomes without mentioning Venezuela, a country where populism has taken an incredibly ugly turn. The international press is exploding with stories of a malaria epidemic outbreak, HIV outbreak, TB outbreaks in Venezuela. The OAS has accused Venezuelan government of crimes against humanity. And now we have a healthcare crisis in the country that's traveling, again, in this age of hyper-sovereignty, traveling across its borders to Brazil and to Colombia as well through outpouring of Venezuelan refugees. This is just an incredibly bleak moment. We are proud to help stand up a dynamic civil society, a courageous civil society in Venezuela. We're working directly with the health ministries in Colombia and Brazil on these necessary interventions, but think that others really need to step to the fore and step into that space. Quick note of hopefulness. I'm taking a little bit of hope, I'm drawing a little bit of hope right now from a number of transitions that are taking place in the world. It gives me tremendous hope that activists in Macedonia of all places, where a year ago we were subject almost to expulsion, those activists succeeded in convincing their new government to commit funding for prevention services for men who have sex with men and people who use drugs upon the departure of the Global Fund. It gives me hope that after years of advocacy, the Global Fund not only made human rights and gender equality programming a key pillar of its strategy, it's devoted millions of dollars to scale up this work and incentivize governments to support it themselves. It gives me hope that the upset of the impact around the global gag rule on HIV funding at the country level are leading to a real charge against these regressive policies, and that all of you in this room and those in the world are not comfortable just living in resistance, but are lifting up prescription everywhere you can find it. I'll just end by once again going back to my note about the 1%. I don't want to be in this club. It's going to be just criminal if the next time we're gathered and having this conversation and parading one activist after another onto these stages to talk about rights violations and rights-based work. It's going to be tragic and criminal if we have not all worked together to compel donors, to compel thoughtful friends that we still have in governance to increase funding to the kind of work that so many of you do courageously and the kind of work that's made a difference in spaces like South Africa, Thailand, and Brazil. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. This really set the tone for where we are, and we don't operate in a vacuum, so it's the political landscape and of all kinds. So thanks so much also for what the Open Society Foundation are doing. Now, the next speaker is Mandeep Dhaliwal, who is the director for HIV Health and Development Group at UNDP, and who has a long track record also in this area, and also asking a question that is going to the heart of the AIDS response and whether we are regressing. Global public goods, multilateralism, social justice, so on, in times of nationalism and so on, the times that Patrick described so well. Over to you, Mandeep.
Thank you, Peter. And it's an honor to be here today, and it's an honor to share the stage with the eminent panelists here. And to have it chaired by Peter. I have to confess that I'm also a longtime survivor of the AIDS response, and before joining UNDP, I was an activist, and worked in the NGO sector and worked on human rights and HIV responses, and I think you might hear a little bit of that activist voice in what I have to say today. Okay, let's see if I can get the technology to work. There we go. So I want to start today by reflecting a little bit about how we've gotten to where we are. The HIV pandemic is fundamentally a pandemic of injustice, a pandemic which casts a sharp focus on pernicious and unacceptable inequities and growing inequalities. The response to the worst epidemic in the world that the world has ever seen is ultimately a powerful public good. A public good that is based on solidarity, a global solidarity that has driven solidarity in communities. It has been driven by transnational and national alliances across constituencies, sectors, and countries. It's brought together scientists, industry, academics, health workers, governments, people living with HIV, their allies, civil society, represented many in the room today. It's a powerful base. It's an unprecedented global mobilization for a rights-based and people-centered response. And I think I want us to remember that and reflect on that, because this is part of the solution to, I think, the very, very vivid and accurate picture that Patrick has painted in his presentation. While we have seen remarkable progress over the last 2 or 3 decades, it's simply not time to declare victory yet. And I want to take a moment to say that I think we have to acknowledge that we caused a great deal of damage over the last 10 years talking about declaring early success and early victories and talking about the end of AIDS. And I'm really pleased that at this conference that's over, and I hope it's over for good. The job is simply not done. But we have the science and tools now to end AIDS as a public health threat in a way that we did not before. So wouldn't it be a tragedy, ladies and gentlemen, if we did not galvanize to really use these science and these tools to end AIDS once and for all? We have persistent challenges, and Patrick talked a little bit about them. New infections are not decreasing nearly quickly enough. Prevention is not prioritized in budgets. 47% of new HIV infections are in key populations and their sexual partners. But UNAIDS reports that only 2% of all funding currently goes to key populations, the populations at greatest risk. 33% of infections are in young people. Structural determinants, human rights programming, critical for addressing structural risks. Very little money, less than 1% goes to this, we've heard. And this at a time when the response and our progress is threatened by growing inequalities, both within and between countries, donor funding on the decline, domestic financing, yes, sure, it's increasing, and that's good news. And of course, we all want countries to own and finance their HIV responses. But will they finance human rights programming? Will they finance law and policy reform that's needed to drive progress on HIV? Stifling civil society. We've seen a great rise in laws and policies to curtail the work of civil society, the very heart of the HIV response, core to the HIV response and core to reaching those who are left behind. I'd like to talk a little bit about a tool which I think is underutilized in the response to HIV and has been utilized the wrong way, but actually we can do more to actually use the law as a tool to drive effective HIV responses. In 2012, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, which was convened by UNDP on behalf of the Joint Program on HIV and AIDS, concluded that the law can actually play a critical role in bridging the gap between vulnerability and resilience, but only when it's informed by science and grounded in human rights principles. On Sunday, the Commission released a supplement which calls on countries to urgently repeal laws and practices based on scientific ignorance, bias, and irrationality, which are impeding effective HIV responses and wasting money. And this supplement, and I encourage you to look at it, provides an important framework and set of recommendations for pushing back on the shrinking civic space, pushing back on the declining funding for HIV, talking about the need to build solidarity across different communities, migrants, prisoners, women, to ensure that we can actually continue to build on the solidarity that characterized the early days of the HIV response and advance a human rights-based response. Multilateralism. Is it a threat or is it an opportunity? Multilateralism, it's important to remember, is built on principles of diversity, human rights, and solidarity. And indeed, in 2015, 193 member states got together and endorsed an inclusive agenda. An agenda which can actually usher in a new era of global cooperation which is more inclusive. One which pledges to leave no one behind, characterized by universality and stronger global solidarity. This agenda can provide a platform to address the intersectionalities and innovation that are required to bring an end to the HIV response. But to do this, we need credible and responsive leadership for the multilateral system to deal with the challenges that are changing and adversely affecting the HIV response. Challenges like migration, xenophobia, populism. So I also want to end on a message of hope. Now's not the time to give in to fears, anxieties, and narratives of dilution, deprioritization of HIV, complacency, and neglect. And I've been in a couple of sessions this week where people have said, well, you know, it's one of 169 targets, and it's, you know, instead of being one of 6, it's now one of 17 goals. I think it's time, in the same way that activists occupied political spaces and the multilateral system, it's time for the AIDS movement to occupy, embrace, and drive the 2030 agenda. Who knows better than what we do that HIV actually can drive progress in many other areas? It's our job to keep HIV high on the agenda. It's our job to drive meaningful integration with health, education, justice, and governance. And there's an interesting framework for this provided in the recent Lancet IAS Commission report in terms of integration, especially with health and education. It's also our job as the AIDS movement to build a broader movement and coalition for health, well-being, and equality that embraces women, young people, people with disabilities, LGBT people, and other people who may find themselves marginalized in today's world. So, we all know AIDS remains deeply political. What does that mean for us as an AIDS movement? We simply cannot afford to regress on the global response to HIV, nor can we accept that these broader negative trends will undermine in the way that they do at this stage. We have to fight back. How do we do this? We have to hold governments, donors, and the multilateral system to account. Time's up for complacency and for not delivering on commitments and not funding sufficiently on these commitments. Time's up on populism. We need to turn populism on its head. It can be a positive force. Reclaim populism as a force for good. Time's up for isolation, stifling civil society, and exclusion. And finally, we need to continue the fight for inclusion, equality, and justice. Time's up for discrimination, gender inequality, and the kinds of inequalities that have gotten us to where we are in the HIV response. We have to be part of the solution for ending this epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. And I think your last slide is the essence of what it's all about. So the next speaker is not arrived yet, and Jürgen Pillay, but we've got Sasha Volpina from the Global Network of People Living with HIV, here based in GNP+, also a pioneering organization where she is a program manager. So this is about the ability to pay and other issues, so talking about the money.
Yes, and about the communities, actually. So we have all the commitments, we have all the declarations, and we even have promises to raise the amount of money which are coming to us. But I think it have not much, to match into the reality. We have all these wonderful things when we are hearing them every year, but what we have, first of all, we don't have enough data about what's going on. It's very hard, to find the clear data that is showing what the resources are exactly coming to the communities, both donors and governments. So donors do not disaggregate the funding by implementing partners, so it's very hard, to really realize, what exact numbers are coming to us. And there are very few assessments on the regional level. So basically, when I was preparing to this presentation, I was talking with the people from the regions, and I was trying to estimate by myself, like, hey guys, how much you have for treatment access advocacy? How much you have for that? How much you have for this? We don't have, I can't build these wonderful graphics here because basically we don't have them. So first about the donors. The first and the main question is who is making the priorities. For my region, for Eastern Europe, for example, the prices for medication is a great issue. We're looking at the budget, especially in the countries of the transition, it's 80% of the budget are just pills. And then I started to ask people around the region, how much you have for that kind of work? And total number for the whole EECA region for 15 countries was $350,000 a year. That's it. For Russia, Ukraine, for everybody. We have one ITPC, part of ITPC grant. We have a bit of from OSF, thanks for that. And we have very, very small grant from AIDS funds, that's it. For the treatment access advocacy for the whole region, which is suffering from the patents and from all that. And you know how much money can save that work? All Ukrainian network managed to decrease the prices a lot for IRTs, and suddenly, the government was able to fund fully for the governmental budget all OST programs. Fully. Because the money are there, actually. And we can advocate and we can, get this money and put them into services for key populations. But even to advocate for that, we need also funds. Project-based funding is one of my favorite ones. Donors have overheads. Everyone has overheads. It seems only communities don't have them. It's only project-based funding, and then we are refused to get the other sources of funding because of the lack of the capacity, of course. And then the requirements are, what are usually the solution from the side of the donors? Go and partner for the big NGOs. Whose capacity is built through that? It's not the communities again. It's the capacity of these big international great NGOs. So it's a vicious cycle. And then you are required to have these wonderful audits. I know the organizations in my region which are constantly under audit. The whole year they have audit because one donor asked for one kind of reporting, the other for the other, and so on and so on. Putting $5,000 into grant and then requiring 9 monitoring forms, this is too much. Though we really want to be accountable, we are those who are fighting actually to get our governments to account. We want to be accountable, but there are some limits of that. One of the, here's the sayings about that from the report. I was presenting that report in the PCB NGO, at the PCB as a member at that time of PCB NGO delegation about the funding. It was 3 years ago, something like that. And we were trying to gather, the reflections and hear the reflections of the people who are working from the ground, about how all that looks. It seems that the donors are pushing the risks down on our shoulders. And we are already at risk, actually, because we all know in what environment we have to work. We are working in repressive political and legal environments. We are already on risk because we are fighting for the rights of the people. And then we have to take the double risks. It is actually unrealistic, in my understanding, to expect that in conditions of criminalizations, we can run services and make advocacy and do that both through the funds of governments. This is unrealistic expectations. We have to find the other way during all that transition, because it seems that this way is not working. I think especially during this transition era, the advocacy have to be like the first priority. Otherwise, how we will monitor? Otherwise, how we will sustain? How we will do all that if we are not funding the advocacy? So about donors, just to finish this part about the donors, we think that it is important to set aside targeted and sustainable funding mechanisms for communities and for advocacy especially, to improve accessibility of funds mechanisms for communities, to simplify these reporting protocols and provide support to communities to develop this accountability mechanism, well, actually basically to synchronize them. Why not donors through all that times are not still able to synchronize this mechanism? Just between themselves. It will save us a lot of time and energy. Donors must reframe, of course, the risk calculations and stop pushing risk down to communities and ensure that funds are available for advocacy and other non-service delivery activities. And start to listen to us. I think it's time. I will talk a bit about the governments, and so first I will speak about my own region. We have already lessons which were very painful, for me especially, and I wanted to use the opportunity and to thank OSF, those who were from the very beginning. I was presenting the work of Front AIDS at 2006 in the conference at the plenary. And it was actually Norwegian aid and OSF, the only ones who risked to support Front AIDS. And we got the political will in Russia at that time, and we were full of hope, and we thought that everything will be there, and Global Fund came into the country, and we stopped dying, and the treatment was there. But in a few years, everything was over. The political will can come and go, the donors can come and go, but we will stay there because basically we don't have way to go. It was very hard times when the treatment again disappeared and we were to establish a new movement, Patients in Control, and actually that was the reason I was to leave Russia, because of the activist work I was doing. And I was already in Ukraine when I got this wonderful, we were among ourselves, among activists, we were naming them the letters of happiness. These letters, wonderful letters from OSF that was saying like, we love you guys, but that's it. Don't answer to that letter. They were supporting our work in treatment access, I was ruling the projects for women who use drugs, and all that was suddenly over. And I can say that, like, comparing how was that, the principal recipient of Global Fund, when was giving me money, they were giving us money to the activists who were working on the ground. But they were saying, like, Sasha, you know, it's your own risk. If something will happen, you are providing us the reports which will say that you are making advocacy trainings, of course not street actions. You can't make street actions if you are, you know, taking money from Global Fund, of course not. So I was writing these reports, and they were saying, if something will happen with you, you know, you are doing it by your own risk. I took the risk, and I was to leave the country. I never heard anything like that from OSF. They were accepting the real reports from me. And actually, it's very weird, you know, to lie into the reports and not to report your own work, to write something something else. So it's very painful always to talk about Russia. For me, it's like really very personal, I can say, still. I'm not there for several years, but it's still very painful. After that, I work in Ukraine, and now I can compare. I can compare when you have political will and when you have funding, because the all Ukrainian network of people living in HIV are principal recipients of the Global Fund money, of PEPFAR money, and how much they could achieve with that. They have decreased the prices, they are now making the reform inside the country. You know, how much can do the communities if they are well resourced and if they have the political will from the side of the government. This is like really very great results. We also have, you know, like other best practices like Croatia or Czech Republic or Moldova Republic or Macedonia, we were already talking about them, where like it seems that actually everything is possible. You will find the way how to provide the money to communities. You will establish all the needed mechanisms. Actually, the main thing you need is political will. If the political will is there, the governments usually find the way. How to transfer the money, how to establish all these mechanisms, how, you know, to solve all that. But only in the case they are willing to do that. I will talk a bit about other regions. This is not, you know, as I was saying, we don't have data. This is just through the talks with the other activists from the other regions. So from LAC region, that's what I got is like champions in receiving at least some money from the governments. What I wanted also to say is that usually it's the money for services. Of course, it's not advocacy. Even what we're talking about, like successes, of course, it's not advocacy. It's services. So there are two models, and they are now working a lot on this social contracting system, and it seems to be like really good working one. They have two models of work. It's direct funding and it's indirect funding, which involves some third parties that are helping to transfer the funding to communities. But I was already speaking about the risk of that system, because in that case, you know, whose capacity you are building. This is the question. And Asia Pacific, I was talking also with the activists about Indonesia and about Malaysia. So the legislation base is actually not really bad. They have the legislation base about the grants and social assistance on national and even local funding on subnational level. But it seems that still all the funding that is coming from NAC still operates international funds. So it's not the governmental fund. They have the mechanism, but it seems that they're not using them by now. But they at least already exist. And for Malaysia, we see like really, really high thresholds. So there are hard Ministry of Finance and regulations, which our activists are saying that they can't match them. There is a registration. You have to be registered in a special NGO list, and history of internal audit for 5 years. So a lot of organizations, they don't see the way how to get the governmental funding. So here's the conclusion, just to echo what I was talking about. We need data. We need ongoing monitoring of situation, needs and assistance. We need improvement of international donors funding, otherwise it won't work. We need political discussions of it is political questions. If the political will is there, everything will be, you know, working. So it is a political question, questions of human rights. It's not a technical, because usually we start to discuss all these technical issues, how to make all that contracting, all that can be solved if the governments are willing to pay. We need practical discussions, of course, of different level, relevant agencies, health lawyers, economists, and us, of course. And we need technical support and capacity growth. And in our understanding, we are not ready. We need longer transition, and we need safety net, and this is not a secret, that there are a lot of countries which still don't have this political will, and where the only way to go is to still have international funds and still have international support of international donors in nearest future. Thank you.
Can you sit next to Okay, thank you to all the speakers. So we will have some about, 25 minutes of discussion time. And I think what we heard was a fairly sober picture with a combination of old issues, but also new issues. And it's always been a struggle, so we shouldn't forget that, including to keep, the human rights framework in what we're doing, and the funding also at the communities has been always a challenge. But what I liked also about the proposal, about the presentations, was that coming up with what's the way forward. And so let's try to talk about that. But before we, are there any people in the audience? Are there microphones, or how does it work? I see the two mics here. Are there any experiences to share, suggestions, so on? And also, not to put you on the spot, but I see Steve Morrison. I know that CSIS has been thinking a lot about this issue also, and maybe you can share later on, Steve, some of your thinking. So let's go with number one.
Thank you very much for those presentations. Robert Banoon from the 3MDG Fund in Myanmar, soon to be the Access to Health Fund. One of the realities at country level in developing countries is that support for human rights, the human rights agenda, and for structural interventions around access and equity and key populations is significantly rolled into the internationally financed partnership for health and development at country level. Yet for many of my own donors, their timeline on the health initiatives is a very short one, and the timeline on the structural interventions is a much longer one, which they need to realise. We have a number of opportunities coming up. One is the global advocacy and platform for universal health care, which is the Global Fund will be very active in that, but this is fundamentally a country-led and country-financed initiative, which is an amazing opportunity to continue those structural interventions around equity and around rights and around access to health services. One final point, the recent support at the World Health Assembly and by WHO recommending structural interventions to support harm reduction at country level was heavily criticised by some, but was seen by those who recommended that at WHO as necessary, and it was it's important. It was listened to. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I think mic number 4, please.
Yeah. Jorge Saavedra is Healthcare Foundation Mexico. I want to make a comment on the ability to pay that doesn't not always translate into funding for civil society, because you mentioned that and you highlighted the case of Russia, which is an international awful example and not of best practice, but I think sometimes from worst practices we also learn. And I think it needs to keep being highlighted, the case of Russia, but also in some other countries, and mainly because that ability to pay is made on the basis of the World Bank classification of countries as upper middle income. When they reach $3,896, that means a year per person, which in the UK or here in the Netherlands will be extremely poor. But if they live there, they are upper middle income. So that's a disastrous classification. But also a worse example than Russia is right now Venezuela, which is still highlighted as upper middle income country. And if you go there, it's a total disaster on every single aspect of life, not just on HIV. Going back on examples that Peter Piot asked to share, I would like to share briefly an example of social contracting that we started in Mexico back in 2003 that I personally negotiated, and we got $3 million for social contracting because I was the head of the HIV program back then, for social contracting with civil society. And then they started, yes, mainly providing services, but we also socially contracted campaigns against stigma and discrimination and against homophobia. So I don't know if that you consider it a service, but it was more like a social advocacy. I feel that way. But other areas of the government started to complain to me, if you are socially contracting a lot of NGOs, why they keep protesting? Say, well, we are not buying loyalty. So do you think it's a risk there that when governments invest on advocacy, they will feel that, okay, we are going to buy loyalty, so they are going not to protest anymore? So I think that might be a risk. That was my comment.
Thank you. No, thank you. That is actually what often happens in practice, you know. That's and it's tension also for, if you're like particularly a service provider at the community level, the only way that, you know, you have loyalty to your people and, you know, your service, and then and you're dependent on the donor. And so that's why I think that it's very important. There was a previous Lancet Commission, there are so many here, but there was a UNAIDS Lancet Commission on AIDS a few years ago, and they made a point that funding community engagement, advocacy, and the groups as such is a global public good because it will benefit everybody. Of course, there was a call to donors. Of course, no donor that was not already doing it, like OSI and so on, they didn't do it. But that's often the expectation of the donor. You get your money and shut up and do what we tell you to do. I see Steve. Please.
Thank you. Steve Morrison from CSIS Washington, D.C., and thank you all for your presentations, which were very compelling. We had a chance, Patrick, Peter and I, and a number of other people, to talk last night, and some of what I'm just going to very briefly say was figured in some of my remarks then. I think we are in the midst of a long-term historical shift. This shift towards nationalist populism, it's rooted in a widely shared discontent among electorates across many different countries. I don't see it as short-term. I see it as one that we're going to work our way through over many years. It's one that, in the short term, has created strategic holes vis-a-vis global health, because the long and very continuous and enormously successful run that global health has had over the last almost 2 full decades rested to a very significant degree upon highest level leadership within Washington and London, and both of those places have flipped and become populist at the level of heads of state, and we have not figured out what replaces that leadership. It's been compensated by many different factors in the American context. Congress has been vitally important. Many different voices have been very important.
Did you say impotent or important?
We can debate on that.
Yeah.
I think we find ourselves today in a very awkward and confusing middle position where the tools that we've developed and relied on, AIDS exceptionalism, high-level leadership in key capitals, that playbook is gone, and this populism that we're seeing is eroding the basic institutions, post-war institutions of the liberal international world order. And it's been largely focused on trade, on security alliances, on political unions, on human rights norms and the like. Global health has not been targeted to the same degree that these other areas have been targeted, but global health is by no means immune from that or separate from it. And so we shouldn't be complacent in thinking that somehow there's an exceptionalism to global health and to HIV in this period of this geopolitical shift. And so we're left with the question that we talked about last night, which didn't result in any clear answers, but where are we going to find the high-level leadership that's going to carry us forward in the next 5 to 10 years on both sustaining high-level political commitments, filling those gaps, and reversing the erosion of the financial foundation that sustains HIV. Many of the other problems that have entered with HIV in terms of complacency, poor messaging, and other things are, I think, more endemic to the HIV community itself. But that broader environment is one that I think we do need to focus on. And thank you so much for all of your remarks.
Thank you very much, Steve. Well, so while we're, you're thinking whether additional comments will be made, may I ask also my fellow panelists to react to some of what we heard. Sasha, you're ready to talk?
Of course I want to.
You should share then that mic, and we share this mic.
Yeah, so my first reaction, of course, on this classification of the World Bank. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that it's used by the donors and it's used by farmers as well. So it means that if you're a high-income country or middle-income country, you don't have donors and and you are patterned all around. So actually, like especially comparing Russia and Ukraine, and I lived in both countries, like in terms of fighting with AIDS, Ukraine was very lucky. It's awful to say that, but Ukraine was very lucky because of the war to raise down in this classification that gives a lot of opportunity to access to treatment, to donor support, and so on. So you have to be at the end of this list. And the classification itself, like being honest, it seems that it just hides the political questions which are underneath that classification, because I think it's just used that way, because of course I think it's not such a hard task to do, to also add to these classifications the expenditures for health and other, there are a lot of things that can reflect the other indicators that can reflect the real situation. And I think we're again speaking about the political will. Is anyone really willing to see at the real picture, or we're just using that because it actually serves the political situation, which was also discussed, this shift we have globally now. So that's...
Yeah. There is, on this is a very important issue, but there's a report that was initiated by the Global Fund and for a committee that was co-chaired by Pascal Lamy, who was the Director or General of the World Trade Organization, and Donald Kaberuka, who was then the President of the African Development Bank, and trying to come up with alternative classification, taxonomy, whatever, not based on just a single GDP per capita definition, a threshold, and also, frankly, some countries, particularly in Africa, that are so dependent for the GDP on the price of commodities, copper or whatever it is. One day they go over it, the next year the price of commodities collapses and they go under, but you're not really, the mechanisms are not there, so they propose the more complex formula but I'm not sure that any progress has been made. These rules are made at the IMF. It's just, so that means, to me, the lesson is that we have to penetrate far more the finance type of establishment, because that's where these decisions, it's in treasuries, not in public health communities that these decisions are made. But it could be a kind of a rallying type of cause, because more and more countries are going to be affected with it by the sometimes slow, sometimes rapid growth of the economy, and suddenly say, oh wow, we are now a low middle income country or high middle income country. It has so many implications, from access to vaccines, the Gavi eligibility, to the price of antiretrovirals, and the access to loans, to IDA funding, and so on and so on. So I think that's a really structural issue, which is not new, but maybe it could be something where activism is also necessary. Mandeep?
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but
Neither am I.
As a human rights person, I mean, and I understand probably less about economics than most of the panel, but from a human rights perspective, I mean, I think we have to reject the use of these classifications for the use of donor assistance for a public health issue. I mean, it just makes no sense to me. And interestingly, the Commission on HIV and the Law in their supplement say this. They say this has no grounding in international human rights law, and how is it that we have just tacitly accepted the use of these classifications, particularly in the transition of donor funding? And there are plenty of examples, which Sasha probably knows better than me, of actually people dying because they didn't have services anymore because of the transition. And social contracting, yes, it's wonderful. It is a way to provide essential funding to continue services, but it doesn't provide funding for advocacy. It doesn't provide funding for core costs. It's not going to solve the problem. It's a bit of a quick fix. It's like putting a little Band-Aid on a wound. But so I think these are small fixes, and I think we missed the boat a little bit when we didn't challenge the use of these classifications for transition in the Global Fund and in other places. The point about that the colleague from Myanmar made about structural interventions, it's not new that structural interventions are needed for health responses. The whole social determinants of health discourse is about that. Combination prevention, coined by UNAIDS years ago, is about behavioral, biomedical, and structural interventions. The reality is people don't like to fund it because, as you say, it takes a longer term. And we're facing this challenge currently with the Global Fund in terms of their funding for human rights programs, because they want to see results in the short term, but actually it takes a longer investment, and that's an important point for donors. Our colleague from CSIS made the point about a new playbook. I can't imagine anybody else coming up with a new playbook than the AIDS movement. That's how we ended up with a global AIDS response, because gay men, drug users, women who were dying, and people who were losing their family members came up with a playbook. And they challenged a lot of things. And I think it's that same community now that needs to galvanize, needs to build solidarity with other movements and come up with a new playbook. And maybe part of that new playbook is rejecting these economic classifications for how the response to the epidemic is funded.
Patrick, thanks.
Sure. Just a few quick things. Just receiving a comment from our brother from Myanmar reminds me that we haven't given enough attention to the healthcare challenges that arise from human rights crisis that lead to massive waves of migration. We know, of course, that on the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh right now, we have hundreds of thousands of Rohingya who have been forced from their communities under the most dire circumstances that can only be called ethnic cleansing. And now we're seeing challenges around TB and HIV that are not receiving sufficient attention from the international community, let alone the human rights challenge there. So just reminded of that because of his intervention.
You know, just thinking about the comment that was made about Mexico and that challenge, you know, of course it strains reason to believe that as the Global Fund departs from middle income countries and those countries pick up their own investments in healthcare interventions and standing up their autonomous healthcare systems, of course it's not likely that they are going to also fund activists to advocate against them and to hold them to account, right? So advocacy requires fierce independence, which is why it's absolutely incumbent upon all of us to make certain that there continues to be funding streams for human rights work in these emerging, in these middle-class countries. But I wanted to really address Steve's points. I'm not going to address them in a fulsome way, but I warned Steve, and I know that you did not mean to suggest this at all, but I want to just caution us about the way we talk about the not too distant past with a bit of hagiography, you know, the way things were and the way things are now. Clearly, there are a set of radical challenges that many of us did not anticipate, and I think you're 100% right to suggest that it's going to take us a while to get out of the toxic environment that we're in right now. But I also just want to remind us all that in the glorified past that we describe, there were a whole lot of people who were being left behind, right? There's a reason why we're getting this kind of reaction from one global capital to another. There's a reason why we're seeing these sharp distinctions between those who don't live in the cosmopolitan centers that many of us have the privilege to exist in. And we should just all remember and appreciate that even in our community, in the AIDS, HIV community, there were many people who were being left behind and continue to be left behind. And, you know, I can say this speaking from a space of authenticity as someone who was active in the AIDS movement in the United States in the late 80s, early 90s, and had far too many friends of color who were dying without treatment, even after the drugs were available because of disparities in care, disparities in access that come out of nothing but a rancid discrimination. So we should just remember that the era, you know, so we should be careful about painting a Disney-fied picture of the era that we have emerged from, as all of us think about what organizing means today to get us to a new horizon.
Thank you, Patrick. So, in other words, it's never been easy, but I think one of the lessons of that past is that when there was progress, it was thanks to action, to organizations, to activism, and not because someone had, you know, showed the leadership and said, "Oh, hi, so let me give you this cadeau, this present." It was every time, you know, and it was, you know, it was good politics and bad politics in both senses, and it's one step forward, two steps backwards. So I think that one question that, not for now because we're coming to the end, but the question is also, do we need to reposition or to reframe AIDS? I mean, there have been calls for kind of total integration, like in the Lancet they said, you know, integrated and universal health coverage is going to solve everything. I'm not sure that I've been in any service or clinic, the mainstream one, where all the populations that, you know, were mentioned are welcome. And we would lose a lot, and it would result in millions of deaths if there isn't a continuing a dedicated funding stream and also services and programs for the people who need it most. On the other hand, there are a number of compelling reasons why we should try to come together much more. When we think of reproductive health and sexual health, that makes total sense. And that's where the gag rule is now doing everything it can to make that impossible in countries or in communities that are dependent on that kind of funding. But we also have not only a looming epidemic of chronic diseases in the world. Just remind you that even South Africa now has rates of obesity among women that are equal to those of the United States. And that's something that happened over the last couple of decades. So that is going much faster than what we saw in high-income countries. And then people living with HIV, even on chronic treatment, are suffering from multi-morbidities, and which also require some more sophisticated care and so on. So there are a number of reasons to try to bring it together, but I think a kind of just a all-out effort to reduce whatever we do under the universal health coverage, I think will be extremely dangerous. Plus, it would throw away one of the, for me, essential features that in the AIDS movement, and that is that we are about to use that term, multisectoralism, that we look and we need to go beyond the health sector in order to ever bring this epidemic under control. I think also that we need to think about, let's call it the soft landing of the rhetoric of the end of AIDS. I mean, it has been, I think, helpful in some quarters, but in the long term it could become something like health for all by the year 2000. And we simply don't even have the strategies and the tools to realize that. We can do a much better job at what we have already. There's no doubt about that. But really ending, for me, end means end. I mean, English is only my third language, but I know what end means. That will require a vaccine. That will require quite a few other things that we don't have yet. So I think some thinking at this conference, and I was happy to hear that there are these discussions that are going on, and that's the beginning of what to do in the current context. And as Mandeep said in one of your slides, and AIDS is and remains and has always been deeply political from day one, and that's why all these struggles were there, and that we are not immune to the shifts that Steve also described, and the first step is being aware of it, not to put our head in the sand, and join forces to see how we can overcome that. Some of it is totally out of control of the AIDS movement, but we can contribute. I always say that, never think that you as an individual or I as an individual can do nothing. We can do something, and we have to try. And if we don't try, then we become co-responsible and co-guilty. And that's why also I think that funding for that is also necessary. And you can't perhaps not expect that indeed from, let's say, a government to do that, although I think in an ideal state the government represents the people, and that means the diversity in the people and so, and that's the res publica in the original sense of the word. But that's where foundations are really important. That to fund, I think also accountability mechanisms that are truly independent, but also this whole human rights dimension and civil society. So thank you to panelists. I think more food for thought, but also particularly more thought for action. And thank you to all the participants. Okay, bye.